Hey everyone, Irene Lyon here. And today I have a special guest, my husband and colleague Seth Lyon. And we're going to talk about a recent series called Stranger Things. So, spoiler alert for those of you who have not seen it. And specifically one season and how it is a perfect metaphor for trauma healing, the trauma vortex, and also how we want to not always focus on positive stuff and going to the light. Now, Seth is much better at describing this series than I am. So, Seth, take it away.
So, the monster in this season of Stranger Things, he was basically represented the trauma vortex. He would only go after kids who were already traumatized. They discovered that there was a shared link there that every victim already had trauma, and that was the way he got in, was through their existing trauma. And there was this one character, Max, who was this girl, and he was after her. And she realized at one point that she could use this song as a resource, which was, of course, Running Up That Hill, Deal with God by Kate Bush. And I'm sure a lot of you remember how that song suddenly last summer, I think it was boom, it's, oh my God, huge song of the summer. And it was because of that scene, which was so incredibly powerful, where she uses that song as a resource, as a way to remember connection with her friends, which is another resource. And she connects to healthy aggression, and she gets away, and she gets her life force, and she runs up the hill, and she escapes. But then
But
what happens is she gets attached to that resource and says, like, oh, well, I'll just keep this playing all the time.
yeah.
And if he tries to come for me again, I'm just going to hide in the light. I'll stay in the positivity that this song brings and that sense of lightness, of resource.
Mm-hmm.
And what eventually ends up happening is he comes into her safe place anyway.
Yes.
And that is what happens if we only stay with resource and positivity. And so it was a really brilliant metaphor, and it sparked this, oh, we should do a quick little
Yeah.
breakdown of that and what that's
Yeah.
about.
Yeah, and what just happened, we're currently in when we're recording this is
Yeah.
probably not when we're going to put this out. But currently, right now, we're in Smart Body, Smart Mind, and I just am in the midst of doing the training calls, the weekly training calls. And one of the first ones is around somatic first aid, and it talks about the four whens. So,
Hmm.
when when to not resource or to resource, when to
Hmm.
orient or not orient, when to take a deep breath, when not to take a deep breath, and then I think the fourth when is what to do when you don't know what to do. And it's kind of like go back to the basics. And one of the things that I'm really clear with is we want to have resources, as Max did in this fictional series. We want to be able to orient, we want to be able to feel our breath and come into our breath and have positive things. And eventually to heal our nasty traumas and our survival stresses that are lurking inside of us in our body, we need to grow enough capacity and knowledge and education so that we can dip into what we would call the trauma vortex,
Yeah.
which is essential. And I think over the last, I don't know, 50 or so years, really in the last 20 years, there's been all this focus on positive psychology,
Hmm.
you know, higher level spirituality, meditation. And we've talked about this so
Yeah.
much in other areas. But sometimes we do want a resource, and sometimes, well, not sometimes, to really heal,
Hmm.
we want to not have to need these resources because we're never going to get through the scary things that occurred to us.
Totally. Yeah, it's just we gotta build up, right? So it's kind of like stages. I look at it at different stages with
Mhm.
trauma healing. Like there's a period of just, a lot of people come into this work and they just feel lost. They just are suffering all the time, and in that period, it's very important to focus on resource, to focus on the light, so to speak, to figure out what soothes you, what comforts you, what gives you a sense of, I can do this, right? A sense of soothing afterwards, something intense. So developing resources, focusing on them is really important for a time. But yeah, then there can come a point where it's like, oh, we can just sort of stay stuck in that, stuck in resourcing. And it's like when it's determining when is the point when I have enough resource that now I can start dipping into the dark, shadowy stuff, knowing that I'll be okay. And you really need to have both. Like there's the positivity stuff like you're talking about. There's also therapies out there that are very confrontational. That just like, yeah, exposure therapies, like to just throw you into the circumstances of your trauma without necessarily preparing you with resource, and that doesn't work either. So right, it's a balance of developing your resource to the point that you know, if I start to go into something that's activating, I know that I'm going to be okay because I know I can go to this thing that will settle me and soothe me. And then eventually that builds or enough capacity that you may not even need to go to the resource. It's like those resources generate the ability to know that you can stay present, and that becomes its own resource. I guess what you would call that an internal resource, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about this happened in another call, not one of mine or yours, but another one of our mentors was talking about people who always have to have music on in the background. I mean, you're a musician, so you like to listen to music, but you're not someone who's always listening.
No.
It's the same notion of someone who's always needing to have the television on when they're home
Right.
alone. So that would be like a real life example to those listening. It's like, well, I'm not in Stranger Things and I'm not in the Upside Down and there's no monster that's going to get me. However, there are these things that we might be doing in our lives without even realizing it that's keeping us resourced to something external because we can't be internal in our insides,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yeah, and this is where we get into the funny concept of how even positive things, positive external resources can be a form of coping that actually can even be an addiction.
Yeah.
You know, being having to go to that yoga class every day, or so if you just, or you don't feel okay, you know, doing even things that you do for yourself that are ostensibly good,
Yeah.
if you have to do them in order to feel okay, that means that okay, well they're keeping you from engaging with something that doesn't feel good,
Yeah.
and that's okay.
Yeah.
But it's like if we want to heal, we have to eventually actually go meet the monster and experience the fear and the terror and the all this grief and whatever may be in there in those really scary places.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like, well, we got to have both, right?
Yeah.
Got to generate that resource, but can't stay with it, can't get attached to it, can't fixate on it, and understand that it's like it's a balance, right? Yeah.
And then maybe as a wrap up point or two things, this is where I see, and I know you see a lot of spiritual work is bypassing
Yeah.
these deep pieces. This is that love and light. Just send peace, send love, send light. That's all lovely. And we want to have that energy of positivity, potential. We want to believe, in a higher vibration.
Yeah.
But to get to that higher vibration, if we want to use that lingo, that language, we have to get into the lower, if we want to call it lower. Is it even lower vibration?
Denser,
Is
denser,
dense.
thick, sludgy stuff,
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of the finer vibrations, those more etheric realms where things are more spiritual and not as dualistic. It's more about unity consciousness and that kind of thing. Yeah, it's lovely, but it's not a place that really you can want to stay. I mean, we're in a duality world, and it's so that again, that's good, but it's a resource that enables us to engage ideally with the thick, sludgy world, right? It's like we want to, I think, bring that lovely energy down into the muck,
Yeah.
and where it can do some good.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it's the spiritual practices, and that's where I started. As many people probably watching this probably know, I started with spiritual practice before I discovered trauma work, and it can be very easy to delude yourself, you know, and not get into the trickier, harder to find areas. So yeah, it's a tricky process and requires a lot of, I think, patience and courage and willingness.
Time.
Yeah, time,
Time.
lots of time. You know, you don't want to go diving into that trauma vortex right away, but you also don't want to skirt around it forever. And it's a learning process of figuring out like how far into it can I go and still be okay. And sometimes maybe you go too far and you feel little bit blown up and frazzled for a day, and like, okay, then oops, okay, that was a little too much. And it can be a process of figuring out how much to resource, how much to go in to
Yeah.
the trauma.
Super. It's a
Yeah,
short one for today. Just, sometimes it's fun to take these media entertainment. I mean, there's so many movies we could break down, Star
totally.
Wars, The Matrix, all the things. But this one just seemed so appropriate for current time.
It really was so apt.
This was a short one, as we said, wanted to cover this topic and this vignette from Stranger Things. If you haven't yet seen speaking of monsters, the Gator alligator
Mm,
monster meme video, be sure to watch that. We'll post that near here because that is a good one to go with this short video. And
sure.
also some of our talks we've had, Seth, around
Yeah,
your transition, if you will, from that spiritual bypass world into the trauma healing world.
yeah,
Great videos. And also my talks with Chris Dierkes, one of our friends and
yeah, that'd be
colleagues,
good too. Yeah,
that we re-released recently in 2023 on meditation and mindfulness. And Chris and I do talk about the monsters deep in the sludgy parts of our being. So thank you, everyone. Thanks, Seth. And we'll see you next time.